Welcome to the mini book podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we're focusing on excerpts from a truly foundational work, Before the Mayflower, A History of the Negro in America by Lerone Bennett Jr. We want to thank you for listening, and please do consider subscribing for future content.
It's an incredible book to get into. What Bennett does is, well, it's more than just history. He's really trying to reorient our entire understanding of the American story.
He is. It's a massive challenge to that common idea that the history of Black people in America just sort of starts on a slave ship in 1619.
Exactly, and that's really the core of his argument. Our goal here is to get into the foundational claims he makes. He demands that you look at history through this lens of continuous Black agency.
Agency, that's the word. It's the through line.
It is. We're tracking this lineage of power, political, intellectual, you name it, that doesn't start in the colonies. He traces it all the way back to ancient Africa, and he shows this continuous stream of resistance that builds and builds all the way up to the modern civil rights era.
That's a huge narrative arc. And we've got three, enormous historical movements to cover to really get it. First, we have to establish what he calls the Majesty of the African past, the cradle of civilization itself.
Right. Then from there, we look at the brutal and very deliberate construction of American chattel slavery.
Yeah.
And, the global wealth that came from it.
And finally, we'll get into that relentless history of protest and struggle, the fight for liberty that defines so much of the experience, right up to what he calls the second Reconstruction of the 1960s. So let's get into this revolutionary view of history.
Okay, so Bennett begins by going right at this massive historical injustice. The idea of Africa as the dark continent.
A myth that was so convenient for centuries.
Incredibly convenient. It served to justify the enslavement of its people. But the book immediately pushes back. It argues that to even begin to understand the American experience, you have to radically reevaluate the continent itself.
And this isn't just a philosophical argument he's making. It's grounded in science and archaeology. He points to a series of what he calls revolutionary discoveries in the mid-20th century that really forced this shift. What was the evidence that made historians have to overturn that old myth?
Well, the most profound stuff was coming out of East Africa, specifically the work of Dr. L.S.B. Leakey at Olduvai Gorge.
Olduvai Gorge, right.
And the findings there weren't just, about finding some old bones. They suggested that the very origin of humankind, the first steps toward Homo sapiens, and really important human inventions like the invention of tool use, happened in Africa first, before spreading to Europe and Asia.
That one fact just changes everything.
It completely reframes the narrative. When you really internalize that, it reestablishes Africa not as a backward place, but as the literal starting point of all human progress.
Okay, so that sets an enormous precedent for human origins. But what about civilization? The next logical step is connecting that deep history to the great cradles of culture we all know about, especially the Nile Valley. What do the sources say about the link between Black people and ancient Egypt?
Bennett brings in evidence from excavations in the Sudan and the Nile Valley, from places like Khartoum and El Badari. And this evidence confirms that people of a, quote, Negro type were not just present, but were influential contributors to Egyptian civilization.
Which directly challenges that traditional, and let's be honest, often racist view that Egypt was just some kind of Mediterranean or, quote, Caucasian civilization that was just sort of dropped into Africa.
Exactly. And this leads right into that really complex and, often politically charged question of what race the Egyptians even were. The sources are clear that the evidence does not support the idea that they were Caucasian.
So what were they?
A vibrant mixed population. A blend of what would be called Negro, Semitic, and Caucasian stocks. The result was a people with black, brown, and yellow skin.
And this is where the historical analysis just slams into modern American reality, isn't it?
It really is. Scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson argued this forcefully. They said that the ancient Egyptians showed the same physical types, the same range of color as you'd find in the American Negro population.
And the book uses this just chillingly powerful analogy to make the point.
It does. It says these were people who, based on their appearance, would have been forced to sit on the back seats of the buses in Mississippi. That link just demonstrates that the arbitrary racial lines used to justify segregation in the 1950s have absolutely no basis in the real history of human achievement.
That is such a powerful connection. It ties the majesty of the ancient world directly to the brutality of the Jim Crow South. Okay, so moving into the established history of Egypt, Bennett gives us some really concrete examples of Black political power. Who are the key figures we need to know?
Well, we have to start with the women who held real power, specifically Queen Nefertari. She was the wife of Ahmes I.
And she wasn't just a queen consort, right? She was much more.
Much more. She was the co-founder of the incredibly powerful 18th dynasty. Her influence was immense. The famous Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie called her the most venerated figure of all of Egyptian history. You can see her importance in tomb paintings and the fact that she was worshipped for centuries.
And on the male side of that power structure, the sources really focus on this incredibly ambitious ruler, Pharaoh Taharqa. He's Tirhaka in the Bible. Came to power around 690 BC. What was his reign like?
Taharqa was a formidable leader, both militarily and as an administrator. Bennett describes him as a capable and energetic king, and even though he had conflicts with the Assyrians, his reign brought about 25 years of prosperity.
And he had some confidence.
Legendary confidence. He was so successful in his campaigns that he boldly dubbed himself Emperor of the World.
And it wasn't just him saying that. The historical record from others at the time kind of backs that up, doesn't it?
It does. The book quotes a famous Egyptologist who labeled Taharqa's rule as an astonishing epoch of nigger domination. The language is shocking to us now, but the fact that a non-white African ruler could, with real justification, call himself Emperor of the World, it just speaks volumes about the military and political might of these ancient African states.
It's such a vital counter-narrative to that myth of a passive, powerless Africa. So if we take that political power and connect it to the intellectual world, we then have to shift west, away from the Nile, to the great Sudanic empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai.
Right. This is this broad belt of territory between the Sahara Desert and the Guinea coast. And for a long time, these states were misclassified, but the sources are clear. These powerful empires were ruled by Negroes.
And the key takeaway seems to be that these weren't just, simple kingdoms. They were flourishing centers of trade, of culture, and of very high learning.
Absolutely. Cities like Timbuktu and Jenne, they became renowned intellectual capitals across the entire Muslim world. These were highly urbanized, sophisticated societies. Commerce was just flowing across the Sahara.
The intellectual vibrancy of Timbuktu is? It's just breathtaking when you read about it. The sources talk specifically about the famous University of Sankore, and it wasn't just for local students. It was drawing scholars from North Africa, even from Europe. What were they studying there?
We're talking about advanced studies in really complex fields: law, astronomy, and even surgery.
Surgery?
Yes, and we have specific, verifiable evidence of this. There's a famous Timbuktu intellectual, Sadi, a historian of the Sudan, and he wrote about how his own brother traveled from the city of Jenne specifically for a successful cataract operation.
Wow.
It was performed by a distinguished surgeon there in Timbuktu. And the implication is just staggering. Advanced, successful surgery was happening routinely in these black-ruled states centuries and centuries ago.
And that same intellectual, Sadi, he had a private library of 1,600 books.
A walking library. And to really underscore the philosophical depth here, the sources mention this conversation that a German traveler had. He found an intellectual in Timbuktu who was not only an expert in Arabic literature, but who also had rare translated manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato.
That just completely annihilates the notion of intellectual inferiority that was used to justify slavery later on.
It does. And the culture wasn't just in the books. It was woven into everyday life. The sources remind us that African religion was often dismissed by early Europeans as simple animism, worshiping spirits and trees.
Right.
But Bennett clarifies it was actually a complex theological system. It was wrestling with the big universal questions. What is man? What is the purpose of life? What happens after we die?
And these sophisticated religious ideas, they were durable. The book notes they survived the Middle Passage and continued to evolve within the traditions of some American Negro churches.
It's the same with art. African art wasn't produced for art's sake, but for life's sake. It was a functional, collective expression of the community. You see this aesthetic power in the bronze heads from Ife, or the incredible cubistic masks.
But maybe the most enduring cultural legacy that survived, the one we can still hear and feel today, is the music.
Absolutely. Bennett points to two fundamental techniques that survived the Middle Passage and really provided the foundation for almost all Afro-American music that followed.
The first being the polyrhythmic percussive technique.
Right, which is just that simultaneous layering of multiple really complex rhythms. And the second is the call and response pattern. A leader sings a line and a chorus answers.
And those two elements together created a musical architecture that was basically impossible to erase.
It's so tangible. The source even mentions this casual but really powerful detail. There were films made in an African village that happened to capture a dance that was a perfect recognizable example of the Charleston.
No way.
Yeah, it just shows that deep, deep cultural continuity.
And we even see it in our language today, these lingering links. Words like goober for peanut, gumbo, tote, yam, and even names like Sambo and Zola, they all come from African languages.
Which brings up a really critical question. Why did so much of this culture survive the systematic trauma of slavery? The historian John Hope Franklin provides this key insight that Bennett really emphasizes.
What was it?
Franklin argued that African culture persisted, partly because the dominant white group in America refused to extend their own culture without reservations to the Negroes they enslaved. So by keeping the enslaved population separate at a distance, they unintentionally allowed this distinct cultural core to survive and even flourish instead of being completely wiped out.
So the very act of exclusion, ironically, preserved the culture it was trying to dominate. That's a fascinating paradox.
It really is. And it sets the stage for this great tragic transition.
The transition from the world of Pharaoh Taharka and the scholars of Timbuktu to the brutal reality of the slave trade. It represents one of the greatest moral contradictions in all of human history. And the sources go right to the heart of the hypocrisy that fueled the system.
The moral dissonance is just. It's staggering. Bennett uses the stunning example of John Newton.
The man who wrote Amazing Grace.
The very same. He was a slave ship captain who held religious services twice a day on his ships. He was literally reading the Bible to his captives. And then later, he becomes an abolitionist and writes, "How sweet the name of Jesus sounds." It just shows how easy it was for people to compartmentalize this immense cruelty.
And the cruelty was absolute, and it was calculated right from the moment of capture. The slave trails were described as a graveyard, just deserted villages, bleached bones on slave trails.
And we hear these tragic individual stories, like the story of Neely, a woman who was so exhausted and so full of despair that she just refused to walk another step toward the coast. And she just died right there.
And then there's the horrific tale of Captain Tamba, an African who actually resisted his captors.
Utterly horrific. He and a companion were whipped and then scarified, which means they were cut repeatedly with knives to leave permanent scars as a warning to others. But the real psychological terror was what they did to 3 other slaves.
I remember this part. It's almost unbelievable.
They were forced to eat the heart and liver of a companion who had been killed. It was a level of calculated terror designed to completely break the will of the enslaved before they even reached the ships. The violence was meant to create total hopelessness.
It's nearly impossible to comprehend that level of brutality. It shows that the violence wasn't random. It was necessary to strip away the mind, not just the body, before the journey even began. But when we get to the American colonies, there's this surprising period, right, in the early 1600s, of racial fluidity that people often overlook.
Yes, that initial status was really ambiguous. Before the 1660s, a lot of Negroes were treated very similarly to poor white indentured servants.
So they worked together.
They toiled together in the fields, fraternized during leisure hours, and there was widespread interracial mixing. They collaborated in siring a numerous progeny. There's even a documented case of an African man who imported and paid for a white servant who he held in servitude.
So the racial hierarchy we think of as permanent wasn't fixed yet. Servitude wasn't permanently racialized.
Not yet. Which raises the critical question, if it was so fluid at first, what happened? What were the legal and economic pressures that forced that change? Why did the wealthy colonial landowners move so quickly to create a permanent racial caste system?
It had to be about the money.
It was about an inexhaustible, unprotected labor supply. The colonial masters realized that Africans, unlike poor whites or Native Americans, had no local ties, no political protections, and the supply from Africa seemed limitless. So they asked themselves, why not? The decision to move to chattel slavery, a system where a human being is legally considered movable property like a chair, was a deliberate, cold, economic choice.
And Virginia and Maryland really led the way in building this legal iron cage in the 1660s. The sources lay out the 3 key laws that made it happen.
Right. First, Negroes became servants for life, no more term of indenture. Second, intermarriage between races was strictly forbidden. And third, and this is the most important one, the legal status of a child followed the status of the mother.
And that's the linchpin of the whole system.
It's the absolute legal linchpin. It guaranteed generational slavery. If a child was born to an enslaved woman, that child was automatically property for life. It didn't matter if the father was a free white man or not. The whole structure was designed for perpetual profit.
The numbers are staggering. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in America. But the book reminds us that the vast majority of enslaved Africans actually went elsewhere.
That's a crucial point. At least 2 million were shipped to the West Indies, and the estimates for Brazil go as high as 18 million. The scale of the transatlantic catastrophe is almost beyond our ability to measure.
And where you ended up made a huge difference.
A profound difference. The sources say it depended on where the dice of fate fell, because there were distinct gradations of hell across the Americas. Bennett argues that the British Protestant colonies, so North America, were the absolute deepest pit of severity.
And the Roman Catholic colonies, Spanish and Portuguese, were comparatively milder. How so? That's an important distinction to understand.
The key difference was the legal recognition of the slave as a person, at least under certain circumstances, even if they were also property. The Spanish system, for example, allowed slaves to purchase their own freedom. It was a system called coartation.
Coartation, what does that mean exactly?
It means self-purchase, and it was a legal right. The master was legally required to accept a fair market price for a slave's freedom if the enslaved person could somehow come up with the money.
So there was an actual legal pathway to liberty, however difficult it existed.
It existed. It gave people an economic incentive and a tangible hope. And there were other things, too.
Yeah.
In some Spanish colonies, if enslaved parents had 10 children, those children could gain their freedom.
So the system in North America was harsher because it essentially denied all those avenues for self-liberation. The property status was total and irrevocable.
Absolutely. And the philosophical difference often came down to attitudes about sex and race. The Spanish and Portuguese were more willing to legally marry Negroes, which led to more of a blending of races. In North America, white men engaged in widespread sexual exploitation, of course, but they rigidly drew the line at legal marriage. They had to maintain that stark legal separation to preserve the racial caste system.
And we have to emphasize, as the source does, that this wasn't just a Southern thing. The economic engine of slavery powered the entire Atlantic world. The demand for sugar, especially, made the slave trade big business for centuries.
And those immense profits flowed directly to the north. Liverpool in England, Nantes in France, and even Newport, Rhode Island became massive slave trading hubs. There's a quote from Dr. Lorenzo J. Green that states clearly that before the Revolution, the slave trade formed the very basis of the economic life of New England.
Their whole economy.
Their whole economy. Sugar, molasses, rum, shipbuilding, distilleries. All of it was dependent on the triangular trade.
It points to a truly global debt, then. The accumulated wealth of England, France, Holland, and colonial America was all fueled by this trade. First, by manufacturing the goods, the copper, the firearms, the chains used to trade for people. And second, by the massive profits from the sugar and cotton raised by that enslaved labor.
The book is very clear on this. The Western world as we know it today is profoundly indebted to Negro labor.
And it's so important to remember that this suffering was met with active resistance at every single stage.
Every single stage. Mutinies on slave ships were so common that the insurance industry actually had to create insurrection insurance. Captain Thomas Phillips noted that Africans were so willful and loath to leave their own country that they would willingly leap overboard and drown themselves rather than be taken. The struggle for freedom was constant from the very first moment.
And if the history of the system is brutality, the history of Black Americans is one of defiant resistance. That defiance was there at the very foundation of the United States. We have to start with the Revolutionary War and the figure of Crispus Attucks.
Attucks' role is so crucial because he connects that revolutionary ideal directly to the Black struggle for freedom. He was described as a mulatto, about 47 years old, and a fearless, commanding leader.
And he was right there at the Boston Massacre.
Or was the center of it. On March 5th, 1770, he was the acknowledged hero, urging the men to stand their ground against the British soldiers. When the first shot was fired, Attucks was hit and pitched forward. He was the first casualty, the first martyr of the American Revolution.
And Black patriots were visible throughout the war that followed. The sources point to individuals like Peter Salem and Salem Poor.
Yes, both of them were explicitly commended for their valor at the pivotal Battle of Bunker Hill. They helped ensure the survival of the early Continental Army.
But this fight just laid bare the massive structural flaw of the new nation, the hypocrisy of liberty.
It's a glaring hypocrisy. Right. The sources give this striking example of a Connecticut preacher who would give these eloquent speeches about freedom while owning a slave named Jack. Even Thomas Jefferson himself, in his draft of the Declaration of Independence, had to delete a clause that condemns the King of England for promoting the slave trade.
Why?
Because the colonies themselves depended on it. They couldn't condemn the king for something they were profiting from.
And the British saw this contradiction and exploited it immediately.
Absolutely. Lord Dunmore's proclamation offered immediate freedom to any slave who would fight for the crown. This is a radicalizing moment. It led to guerrilla raids by former slaves, burning their former masters' homes.
There's that incredible story of Colonel Hutchings.
Incredible. He was led into the British lines by his own ex-slave, who then struck him across the face with a saber. It's a moment of profound humiliation and reversal of power. And even after the Revolution, some ex-slaves, knowing they had been betrayed by the new republic, kept fighting guerrilla actions as late as 1786, calling themselves the King of England soldiers. They knew the promises of the Declaration had not been extended to them.
Beyond the battlefield, we see Black genius shaping the intellectual landscape of this new nation. One of the earliest and most remarkable voices was Phyllis Wheatley.
A slave girl, purchased by the Wheatley family in Boston, and by the time she was 20, she was an internationally known poet.
Celebrated across the Atlantic, she wrote in that classical style like Alexander Pope. The very fact that an enslaved young woman could achieve international literary fame, could write a eulogy for Harvard. It's just a testament to the suppressed intellectual capacity that slavery tried so hard to deny.
And then you have Benjamin Banneker, the self-taught Maryland Negro astronomer, mathematician, and almanac author.
His genius was legendary. The sources mention his unusual habits, how he'd study all night and sleep during the day.
Banneker's most powerful political act, though, was his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. He sent Jefferson a copy of his almanac, and he used that opportunity to remind the Founding Father that his noble words about liberty were one thing, but the harsh reality of slavery was another. It was a direct, articulate challenge to the nation's hypocrisy from a Black intellectual of undeniable genius.
But the ultimate form of resistance, the one that planted the seeds of destruction for the slave system, was armed revolt on the plantations. And we have to begin with the most successful one, the revolution in Haiti, which was then called St. Domingo.
The Haitian Revolution is the model for successful liberation. In 1791, while the French planters were debating the lofty meanings of liberté, fraternité, égalité, the sources grimly note that Black men sharpened their knives.
And the planters were oblivious. They heard the constant boom, boom, boom of the drums and just dismissed it as worshiping tribal gods.
Never realizing that those rhythms were a communication network, organizing thousands of men for a revolt. In August 1791, over 100,000 slaves rose up. They created a wall of fire, burning cane fields, killing their masters. And out of that chaos rose the brilliant military and political leader, Toussaint Louverture.
He was incredible. Restored cities, administered justice, worked relentlessly. The book says he slept only 2 hours out of 24.
And even though he was eventually captured by the French and tragically left to die in a dark, dank cell, the example of Haiti was undeniable. It proved that mass liberation through armed struggle was possible.
And that example inspired others, like Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia in 1800.
Exactly. Gabriel was a deeply religious man, inspired by Old Testament figures like Samson. And his plan was incredibly ambitious to create an independent Black state right there in Virginia.
His plan was meticulous, wasn't it? Gathering scythes, swords, and pikes.
Very meticulous. But the plot was betrayed by two fellow slaves on the very day the strike was planned. Gabriel was arrested and hanged, along with 34 of his men.
But his defiance was powerful. At his trial, one of his co-conspirators made this statement that directly echoed the American Revolution itself.
He did. He said he had nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British. He was equating the struggle for Black liberation directly with the struggle of the Founding Fathers.
Just an incredible claim of moral equivalence. And then 2 decades later, in 1822, we see Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in Charleston.
Vesey was a charismatic, free Black man, and he used two powerful tools to organize. First, the Bible, telling the story of the Israelites being delivered from bondage, and second, the successful example of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti.
He was a master teacher of resistance. He would read abolitionist papers to the enslaved population and insisted that God helps those who help themselves. His plan was devastating.
It was. The plan was to strike at 6 points in the city and, for their own safety, kill every white man, woman, and child. He justified it by citing scripture, and it mirrored the terrifying tactics used in St. Domingo.
The fear that must have gripped Charleston when that plot was uncovered.
It was pure terror. The plot was betrayed, leading to frantic arrests. Vesey and many others were executed. But his influence was so profound. The source notes that one slave confessed he feared Vesey more than he feared God. That shows you the level of dedication and organizational power Vesey commanded.
So as the 19th century moves on, the struggle shifts from these isolated, though powerful, revolts to more organized movements. And the book makes a really crucial argument here. The anti-slavery movement was not a crusade led by benevolent whites. Negroes were in the vanguard.
That is a fundamental point. Early on, free Negroes actively resisted the efforts of white groups to send them to Liberia through the colonization movement. They knew this was often just an anti-Negro, pro-slavery tactic to get rid of them.
And they made their position clear.
Very clear. They declared, this is our home, here we will die. They weren't asking to leave, they were demanding full citizenship right where they were.
This agitation gave rise to a powerful intellectual core. People like David Walker, whose Walker's appeal was so revolutionary that Southern governors called secret sessions of their legislatures just to figure out how to suppress it.
And it also helped inspire white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who explicitly said he took his stand on Thomas Jefferson's own Declaration of Independence.
But Bennett argues that the most potent force in abolition wasn't an organization or a pamphlet. It was the fugitive slave.
Yes, they were the greatest of the abolitionists. They forced the nation to confront the evil of the system just by escaping. They, quote, lectured with their feet.
And the prime example, of course, is Frederick Douglass.
From slave to world-renowned orator and editor of the North Star, Douglass became so eloquent, so well-versed in philosophy and politics, that some white abolitionists actually started to doubt he had ever really been a slave.
So he had to write his autobiography just to prove his own life story.
Exactly. His very existence was a living, breathing refutation of every pro-slavery argument.
And then you have these other incredible figures like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth.
Harriet Tubman. John Brown called her the most of a man naturally that I ever met with. Her philosophy was simple, liberty or death. And her ruthlessness was about survival for the whole network. She carried a pistol and famously said, "Dead niggers tell no tales," to stop any tired, despairing fugitive from turning back and betraying the routes.
And Sojourner Truth, who was illiterate but so powerfully eloquent and mystical. The book recounts her famous weasel in the Constitution speech.
It's brilliant. She described looking at the Constitution, and it seemed mighty big, but when she felt for her rights, there ain't any there. So she concluded that the Constitution, like a piece of wheat, had a little weasel in it, a weevil, a flaw, that was eating away at its core promise of liberty.
The sheer ingenuity of the Underground Railroad speaks volumes. The story of Ellen and William Craft.
It's like something out of a movie. Ellen, who was very light-skinned, posed as a wealthy Southern planter traveling first class, and her husband, William, acted as her devoted manservant.
Or Henry Box Brown, who literally shipped himself from Richmond in a box via Adams's Express.
These are just heroic acts of agency and self-liberation. And it's this unrelenting resistance that finally brings about the Civil War. But initially, the Lincoln administration refused to frame the conflict as a moral struggle.
Right. They kept insisting it was a white man's war. They were still barring black men from the army and even returning fugitive slaves to their masters.
But the turning point was pure military necessity combined with the moral pressure from the enslaved themselves. The huge flood of fugitive slaves flocking to Union lines forced the North to define their status. That, and the brutal efficiency of the Confederate Army, forced a change in policy.
And once they were allowed to fight, Negro regiments demonstrated incredible courage.
The highest order of courage. You see it in the bloody assaults at Fort Wagner and the grim fighting at the Battle of Olustee. But even as they fought for the Union, they were also fighting for their own dignity.
The pay issue.
Exactly. Black soldiers were promised $13 a month, same as white privates, but then they were insulted with an offer of just $7. Many regiments courageously refused any pay at all in protest.
The story of Corporal Miles James at Newmarket Heights just exemplifies that dual fight.
It's incredible. His arm was shot away, turned into a dripping mass of blood and pulpy tissue. But he dropped to his knees, loaded and fired his gun with his one good hand and kept cheering his men on. They were fighting for the nation and for their own humanity, all at the same time.
So after the Union victory, we get to Reconstruction. And the hopes of the freedmen were just immense, but also deeply personal.
So personal. Freedom meant getting married legally in front of a preacher. It meant choosing two names, often rejecting the master's name. And maybe most fundamentally, it just meant the simple freedom to rest when you chose to.
And this era was marked by what the book calls a mania for education and land.
A mania. Black mothers, who knew that knowledge was power, would walk for miles to get their children into school. They worshipped the miraculous ABCs. They knew that literacy was the key to true freedom.
And the greatest hope for economic freedom came from the radical Republican Thaddeus Stevens. He demanded that the large plantations be broken up to provide land for the freedmen, the dream of 40 acres and a mule.
But that dream was tragically doomed from the start. General Howard, who was head of the Freedmen's Bureau, had the devastating task of telling them the land wasn't coming.
The scene described in the book is heartbreaking.
It is. He stood before an assembly of freedmen and was so choked up he couldn't speak. He asked them to sing a song, and an old woman started singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." And Howard just broke down and wept, confirming that the dream of economic independence was stillborn.
So the economic foundation for true equality was destroyed before it was even built.
At birth. And yet, despite that, Black political leadership thrived during that short period of Black Reconstruction, from about 1867 to 1877.
Black men held seats in the House and the Senate. Hiram Revels, Blanche Kelso Bruce. The book paints this vibrant picture of the South Carolina State House, with Black doorkeepers, a Black chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee.
But this visible, functioning political power was met with immediate, sustained, and organized violence. The Ku Klux Klan was organized in 1866, and it began a campaign of systemic terror designed to overthrow those Republican state governments.
The numbers are horrific. The sources report at least 5,000 Negroes died for their political beliefs, including things like the whipping death of a 10-year-old nurse just for being in the wrong place.
And the final nail in the coffin was the Compromise of 1877.
That's when the federal troops were withdrawn after the contested Hayes-Tilden election.
Exactly. And that catastrophic retreat led to what the book calls the long process of whipping the Negroes into submission. The North looked away. They started embracing racist myths, like the myth of the contented slave, so that the nation could reconcile, but at the expense of Black freedom.
And that collapse of Reconstruction leads directly to the birth of Jim Crow.
Right. The Jim Crow wall was built brick by brick. And the name itself came from a minstrel character, T.D. Rice's Jim Crow, which immediately ties the whole system to this grotesque mockery and caricature.
And the wall was fueled by fear and frenzy, often using the dangerous rhetoric of the cult of white womanhood.
That rhetoric was everywhere. The book quotes the South Carolina demagogue Cole Blease, who said, "To hell with the Constitution if it came between him and white women's virtue." And this ideology led to these absurd legal extremes, like separating the deaf, dumb, and blind by color, or forbidding white nurses from treating Negro men.
And this pervasive violence was then legally sanctioned by the highest court in the land.
The Supreme Court withdrew federal protection in the civil rights cases of 1883. But the most devastating legal blow was the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896. It established the doctrine of separate but equal.
We have to pause on Plessy. This decision enshrines segregation into the legal fabric of the nation. But Justice John Harlan, in his famous dissent, he saw exactly what was coming.
He did. He correctly predicted that the Plessy decision would not lead to equality, but to additional aggression. And he was completely prophetic. Before 1899, only 3 states required Jim Crow waiting rooms. After Plessy, Jim Crow just metastasized. It spread to streetcars, residential areas, public parks, everywhere.
And the promise of equal was just a legal fiction.
A total fiction. It was designed only to enforce separation. That decision created the legal groundwork that had to be fought for the next 60 years.
And this era of deepening oppression forced this painful debate on the right path forward. And it's epitomized by the famous confrontation between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Booker T. Washington, as president of Tuskegee, he advocated for a program of industrial education, economic stability, and, for the time being, political submission. His famous Atlanta Compromise speech used that analogy. Cast down your bucket where you are.
Meaning, Black Americans should focus on mastering local economic skills and vocational trades and not agitate for political or social rights right away.
Exactly. The critique of his program, though, was that by conceding those rights at such a critical moment, he may have inadvertently smoothed the path to proscription. He was giving up the fight for immediate equality in exchange for a hope of economic possibility.
And the great challenge to that idea came from W.E.B. Du Bois.
Du Bois threw down the gauntlet in his 1903 masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk. He demanded immediate full integration, and he insisted on higher education for what he called the talented tenth, the highly educated minority who would then lead the masses through intellectual and political action.
Du Bois was so focused on the psychological burden of race, what he famously called the veil. For listeners who might not be familiar, what did he mean by that?
The veil was this sense of separation. It was the crushing weight of constantly seeing yourself through the eyes of a prejudiced white society. It created what he called a double consciousness, where a black person was always aware of being both an American and a Negro, and unable to fully reconcile those two identities because of the nation's prejudice.
The sources capture his personal feeling about this in that memorial he wrote for his deceased infant son. It's so powerful.
It is. He whispers, not dead, but escaped. Not bond, but free. It perfectly captures his belief that only outside the bonds of Jim Crow life could a black person find true freedom.
So the Du Bois camp organized politically with the Niagara Movement in 1905, demanding the abolition of all racial distinctions.
And that momentum led directly to the formation of the NAACP in 1909 and the Urban League in 1910.
And it's important to know their missions. The NAACP quickly focused on legal warfare. They were fighting these major court battles against the grandfather clause that disenfranchised black voters and against residential segregation. They were the legal spearhead attacking Jim Crow.
Meanwhile, all of this despair and violence was driving a massive demographic shift. The Great Migration. Southern Negroes were fleeing the failure of sharecropping, where you'd work a whole year and end up owing the man $400, and the increasing horrors of lynching, which the sources call a hybrid of sport vengeance.
And the black press played a huge role. The Chicago Defender under Robert Abbott really crystallized the mood, running these encouraging headlines that spurred hundreds of thousands of people to move north.
But that huge influx led to intense racial friction in northern cities. It culminated in the Red Summer of 1919, which saw 26 major race riots across the country. Horrific violence in Chicago, Washington, D.C.
But 1919 was different. It revealed a new, dangerous element.
Yes, Negroes fought back. The riots were no longer just one-way massacres, and the sources note that this resistance caused some whites to feel a fierce joy at the sight of black men finally fighting back against attack.
And out of all this despair and violence, another major movement arose, Garveyism.
Marcus Garvey's black nationalist movement in the 1920s gained huge traction by glorifying blackness, declaring himself provisional president of Africa and advocating for separation. Garvey was shrewd. He exploited the profound cynicism of the masses who had lost all faith in the promise of American integration.
Then the Great Depression forced another crucial shift, a political realignment.
A huge one. Black voters, realizing the Republican Party as Lincoln had long since abandoned them, switched their allegiance in large numbers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Democratic Party. This new voting bloc gave them unprecedented leverage.
And the 1930s saw this intensified legal warfare, funded in a really surprising way.
Through a young white man named Charles Garland, who refused to accept a $1 million inheritance, that money went to fund the NAACP's legal arm, and lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and William Hastie were leapfrogging across the country, fighting to equalize segregated facilities based on the 14th Amendment.
This legal strategy eventually reached a tipping point.
It did. By 1945, Thurgood Marshall decided the time had come to stop fighting to equalize segregated facilities. He decided it was time to go for the whole hog on the 14th Amendment and argue that segregation itself was unconstitutional. This is what set the stage for Brown v. Board of Education.
But before that legal battle reached its climax, we can't overlook that brilliant strategic power play by A. Philip Randolph.
During World War II preparations, Randolph recognized his leverage. He threatened a massive march on Washington of 100,000 men unless Negro demands for fair employment in the war industries were met.
And the threat alone was enough.
The threat alone. It forced President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, which barred discrimination in federal war industries and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee. It was a stunning demonstration of the power of organized, nonviolent direct action. It proved it was a political weapon of immense power.
And that brings us to the second Reconstruction of the 1950s and 60s. It all starts with that massive legal breakthrough, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. It declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, which fundamentally destroyed the legal basis of the Plessy ruling.
The South's response was immediate and furious. Massive resistance and the promise of a century of litigation. And into this crisis stepped Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a third-generation Baptist preacher who was deeply influenced by Gandhi's passive resistance techniques.
King had what the book calls an instinct for symbolic action. He knew the struggle needed drama and moral clarity. And this began with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, after Rosa Parks' arrest.
That simple act of economic withdrawal, which was sustained for over a year, proved the effectiveness of nonviolent mass action.
And the movement quickly escalated into direct confrontation and, crucially, federal intervention. The most dramatic example has to be Little Rock in 1957. Daisy Bates led those students who faced down violent mobs just to enter Central High School.
And this forced President Eisenhower to make a momentous decision. He sent in the 101st Airborne Division. This was the first time in 81 years that federal troops had been deployed in the South, specifically to defend the constitutional rights of Black Americans.
The book captures the emotional impact on those children who were escorted by the soldiers.
It does. One of them said, "For the first time in my life, I truly feel like an American."
That feeling of agency and legitimacy must have fueled the next wave of protest.
It did. The student sit-in movement started in 1960. 4 North Carolina A&T students just sat down at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro and refused to leave when they were denied service.
And that one simple act of defiance just exploded.
It inspired an unprecedented wave of passive resistance across the entire South. 70,000 students across 20 states engaged in sit-ins, boycotts, demonstrations. It was the children of Du Bois' talented 10th, putting his principles into direct physical action. It showed that this long history of resistance had finally crystallized into a true mass movement.
But even with these stunning victories, the book reminds us that this is still an unfinished conflict. The 1962 Meredith crisis, James H. Meredith's enrollment at Ole Miss, led to what's called the Mississippi Insurrection.
The violence proved how fundamentally divided the nation still was, and how deeply entrenched that racialized power structure really was.
The atmosphere of that violence was captured by a French reporter, Paul Guichard, who was actually killed during the rioting at Ole Miss. His final dispatch contained this haunting line:
"The Civil War has never ended. And this ongoing struggle," the source concludes, "always connects back to that tension in Thomas Jefferson's declaration of a massive all-well, that massive unfulfilled promise of equality for everyone."
To really grasp the depth of this conflict, Bennett insists we have to confront the hidden subtext of American history: miscegenation, the mixing of races, and the power of that idea.
It's pervasive. And it didn't wait for the plantations. It started with the slave traders on the Guinea coast.
And we talked about that colonial fluidity, where white indentured servants and Negro servants fraternized and had children. But on the plantation, that casual mixing turned ugly. It became a mechanism of sexual exploitation and control.
The reality of the plantation was brutal. The sources cite a planter telling Frederick Law Olmsted that not a likely-looking black girl is not the concubine of a white man. Planters' wives knew this was happening. Some even called themselves mistresses of seraglios, basically managers of their husbands' harems.
Which led to this sickening paradox of paternity. White fathers frequently sold their own children into slavery.
They did. But there were also documented cases of wealthy planters who freed their mistresses and their mulatto children and sent them north for safety and an education.
The book gives examples.
It does. Robert Purvis, a brilliant abolitionist, was the son of a wealthy Charleston merchant and a free Negro woman. The Healy brothers are another incredible example. One became the first American Negro Catholic bishop, and another became the president of Georgetown University. Their stories just showed that despite the rigid legal system, the reality of race mixing was everywhere, at all levels of American society.
And, of course, the sources conclude by mentioning the long-standing rumors surrounding Thomas Jefferson and his slave, Sally Hemings.
Right. While the full truth is still debated by some, the sources cite the physical evidence and the family testimony, including a descendant who was nicknamed Jefferson Hair Gertie because she had sandy red hair that matched descriptions of Jefferson's. The fundamental point is that race and sex have been intertwined at the very foundation of the American project.
What an incredible, sweeping look at history. We've gone from the sophistication of Olduvai Gorge and the University of Sancor through the brutal construction of the American economic engine and ended with the ongoing struggle in Mississippi. Lerone Bennett Jr.'s narrative in Before the Mayflower is not just a history of oppression, it is a profound story of continuous, evolving political and intellectual thought that spans millennia.
It is a narrative defined by agency.
Yeah.
From the regal builders of the Sudan, through the strategic defiance of leaders like Gabriel and Vesey, the uncompromising eloquence of Douglas and Du Bois, and finally to the brilliant, nonviolent power plays of A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
The tactics keep changing, but the core objective of liberty is that constant defining thread of Black history.
It becomes utterly clear then that the Central American conflict is this collision between the nation's soaring stated ideals, that massive allele in the Declaration, and the deeply entrenched reality of racialized power and systemic contradiction. That conflict has really driven every major historical development in the United States.
Indeed. And despite all the undeniable progress that's documented here, the text ends with a very stark, challenging reminder for all of us. When you compare the Negro's progress to the progress of other minorities in America, that progress pales into insignificance. And that's because of the structural nature of this racialized power. So what does this long, unrelenting history of resistance, from the shipboard revolts and the bloody plans of Gabriel and Vesey to the sit-ins, the legal battles, and the March on Washington threats, what does that tell you about the true necessary cost and the persistent evolving methods required to really achieve equality in a nation that was born with such profound, defining contradictions? The struggle, as Bennett concludes, continues in the wrestling toward the breaking of the day.